Ahoy! Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, the next Borderlands spin-off, is just around the corner, and I believe that this game has the potential to become the best Borderlands game yet. So far, in my opinion, this title is held by Borderlands 2, and most user reviews as well as Metascore from general reviews reflect that as well. Of course, this is still down to personal preference, and there are aspects of the other Borderlands titles that many people prefer. And this is where Wonderlands comes in, because I think from what we know so far, it seems to combine a lot of the more appealing elements of later titles, while also having some learned lessons from the most recent ones. Now, a quick introduction to Wonderlands if you're not in the loop yet. If you are, then you can skip that down below with a timestamp. Wonderlands is not a DLC, but it's kind of grounded in a DLC. Borderlands 2 had a DLC called Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep. This DLC had a theme somewhere between Dungeons and Dragons as well as MMOs, had a ton of references, fantasy style, and even some unique weapons abilities that kind of leaned into this theme. It is generally regarded as one of, if not the best Borderlands DLC. And it was very sad when they actually didn't include anything about it in Borderlands 3. I was kind of disappointed with that because that was one of the major reasons I bought the Season Pass at the start. Turns out the wait will be rewarded though, because Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a complete standalone experience that essentially is the same length as normal Borderlands titles. Along with that, it will have its own DLCs, so it's building this entire new universe, but still under the umbrella of the Borderlands universe, played by some Borderlands characters and probably with plenty of references to them as well. Much like in Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep, in Wonderlands you're also playing a character that's playing a character in a board game. So for the entire duration of the game you're playing a tabletop game, a Dungeons of Dragons-like game, with Tiny Tina as the game master. Due to the very chaotic nature of Tiny Tina, the game doesn't take itself very seriously, and a lot of random things can happen, which was the appeal of this entire concept from the start. But of course, it wouldn't be a Borderlands game if you weren't the hero with crazy weapons who would have to blast their way through hordes of enemies. So now that you have a general idea of what Wonderlands is, there's just one more thing to mention before we get into the reasons, and that is that I am cursed, and every game I get excited for somehow fails miserably. So let's just hope that this one's the one that breaks that curse. Reason number one. The foundation of this game is very strong, with it already being a fan favorite DLC. It is in many ways an already safe and tested formula, something I usually dislike because I prefer innovation from devs. But given the fact that Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep was only a DLC that wasn't all too long, I think this is actually fine in this case, because they're just expanding on an already decent and original concept that they didn't go into too much depth with yet. The second reason, and that's one that's very important these days in my opinion, is the technological side. The engine and the graphics seem to be the same as in Borderlands 3. Which means that the whole issue of bad optimization on launch is probably not gonna happen, at least to the same extent as in Borderlands 3. Obviously there are always drivers that have to come out to optimize things a little bit, but when you can work with foundation of another game that's already using the same technology, chances are it's gonna run a little bit better from the start. Borderlands 3 running poorly on a lot of PCs was a major issue on launch that drove quite a few people away from the game, so this being less of a concern is something very good. We had a similar situation with Borderlands the pre-sequel before, which was launched after Borderlands 2 with the same technology, and this game had other shortcomings that caused issues, but the technology side was one that was less of a problem at least. The third aspect that I'm hopeful about is the writing. One of the big problems that especially Borderlands 3 had was that the writing was just not that great, and that's putting it nicely. There was a lot of criticism regarding especially the main storyline that I don't even want to get into in detail, but it just wasn't very good. This has been acknowledged and addressed by the writers, and also made references to the DLCs where they thought they got the writing down a little bit better. And I gotta say that while a lot of the DLCs in Borderlands 3 still had their own shortcomings, I played them recently, and especially the Creek DLC, the last of the first Season Pass, was very good when it comes to writing specifically, in my opinion. So if they can manage to carry this writing style over to Wonderlands, I think there's a lot more potential there. And the foundation is also a lot easier to work with because of this gimmicky, crazy world that's going to be used where anything can be changed within split seconds. Aspect number 4 is melee. Now, melee is a playstyle that has been in every single Borderlands title since the first one, and usually there's at least one character with a skill tree that facilitates melee, so there must at least be a significant portion of the player base that's interested in that, and I'm among those. I've played a melee character in pretty much every Borderlands. Not every playthrough was melee, but a lot of them were because I really enjoy that. The downside of melee was often that it made your weapon choices very restrictive because you specifically needed weapons with melee attachments for increased melee damage. This is getting solved much better in Wonderlands by now introducing complete melee weapons that you're using along with your guns. They're not replacing guns, they have their own slot and they have their own parts, so they can drop in various variations of the different weapon and are just a more essential part of the combat that you can use if you want to. It doesn't mean that you have to though, because it seems there will generally be more varied playstyles between people using mostly guns, melee, action skills or magic even, and just mixing it up to however they prefer, and depending on which class you're picking, they'll also have influence on that. Which brings us directly to point number 5, the character customization. Both visually and in regards to things that actually influence the combat in your playstyle. Before we go on, a quick reminder to subscribe and click the bell if you're interested in this video, because I will also be posting a counterpart to this very soon, so if you don't want to miss out on that, you want to get notified. You can fully customize your character now in terms of looks, voice and whatnot, and you can also customize your character's stats later through something called hero points, which is different from the Guardian or Badass rank from previous titles. Something like that still exists as well though on top of the hero points. You're also choosing 2 different classes now that you combine, and the second class can be changed indefinitely later down the road. So compared to previous Borderlands titles, you have a lot more control in order to make the character exactly what you want it to be. Point number 6 is the endgame loop. This is something that in my opinion was always a little bit lackluster in Borderlands. There were some raid bosses and stuff like that, but generally once you played through the game it became more of a farm better weapons to farm better weapons to farm better weapons to farm bosses, with not all too much purpose behind it. In Wonderlands there will be the chaos chambers. These are randomized endgame dungeons that have various different elements to them, like different maps, different enemy types that are mixed together and different additional effects, and you can control the difficulty of this dungeon on the fly essentially. Like while you're in the dungeon, depending on which door you choose, you get increased or decreased difficulty, like you get enhancements or debuffs, and it will affect your playthrough. Essentially it's similar to a roguelike, though not quite the same, and one thing we know about roguelikes is that they tend to have a lot of replayability. Point number 7 are certain improved mechanics and quality of life improvements. Borderlands has introduced some interesting mechanics over time, like for example slamming in the pre-sequel, sliding and mantling in Borderlands 3, but sometimes they felt a little bit unpolished or too situational, because they often really needed specific perks to make them effectively usable, especially slams. In Wonderlands, you'll be able to slam from normal jump height without needing any extra perks, which means slams can be used a lot more often. You can also one-shot barrels after you launch them into the air, and you can damage chests to open them. For example, you can slide into them or you can melee them. This should make the more boring aspects of the game feel faster and more fluid, and also add more utility and more flexibility into combat. Aspect number 8 is the introduction of both a new damage as well as a new armor or defense type. Dark magic has a life-stealing component that allows you to heal by dealing damage, something that was already in previous Borderlands, but now it has its own type essentially. And the new armor type is bone armor, which means you will have to switch up your playstyle more, because now we're looking at 4 different types of armor health mitigation, however you want to call it. I think Borderlands combat had grown a little bit repetitive, and adding some more variety to it is, in my opinion, a welcome addition. Aspect number 9 is purchasable quest loot. Apparently, you will be able to buy the loot that you can get from quests from vending machines as well, which means you don't have to reset quests 100 times to get a specific item that you want with a specific loadout if you're willing to wait until it shows up in a vending machine. They're apparently going to be really expensive in return, which kind of keeps your currency more important. But I think that's a good addition because the whole locking an item behind a quest that you can never see again afterwards was pretty annoying. Point number 10 is a full reset on the enemy types. For the longest time, the enemies in Borderlands were pretty much the same guys over and over and over. And psychos and robots are fun to fight, but at some point it gets a little bit stale and it makes the games kind of seem a little bit samey. Wonderlands having this completely different theme means we will not be seeing these enemies, at least not much, and when we're seeing them there will probably still be some different varieties. Now obviously some combat mechanics are going to be taken over and transferred onto new different looking enemies, but generally speaking there was a lot of change compared to what I was seeing in Borderlands 3 already. I'm most certainly going to enjoy fighting land sharks more than another 500 Hyperion loaders. And last but not least, point number 11 is De-clutter. According to the early reviewers that were able to play a few missions at this point, the game is significantly less visually overloaded than Borderlands 3 was. This may not sound that important if you haven't played Borderlands 3, but the game basically got to a state where towards the late game you were looking more at the minimap than you were looking at your actual screen because there was so much stuff happening at once. Scaling this back so we can see what we're fighting again is definitely an improvement, and I'm hoping that this remains true even in the late game, especially in the Chaos Chambers, where there will be a little less control over that. But I guess the visual effects from weapons and so on would still have an impact here, and if they scale those down a little bit, that should have a major contribution to it not getting too cluttered. Now, while I am very hopeful for Borderlands, I have been burned too many times to be a foolish optimist. There are many aspects of Wonderlands that I'm also concerned about and that I think the devs need to get right in order for this game to reach its full potential. What are these aspects? That is something we will cover in the near future in the next video, so if you'd like to see that, again, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you get notified when that comes out, because that's a little bit too much to all put in a single video. Once it's released, I'll try and remember to link it here at the top as well. I'd also like to hear from you guys in the comments what you think about Wonderlands. Are you interested in it all, and how do you feel about the game? Are you more on the cautiously optimistic side, or maybe cautiously pessimistic because you don't want to get burnt? Let me know, I'd like to hear it, and I thank you guys very much for watching, and hope to see you for the next one soon. Duke Sloth, out. Oh, and I almost forgot, so maybe you forgot too. If you want to support me making Borderlands content, it would also help a lot if you click the like button, of course.